Today is May 19th, 2026, and President Trump just posted the most operationally consequential statement of this entire conflict. Not the Truth Social post with the American flag superimposed over a map of Iran, with arrows converging from every direction in the Middle East, though that was a statement in its own right. Not the post where he said, "The clock is ticking and there won't be anything left of them." Not the post where he described the Iranian regime as screaming all the time, while sending proposals that have nothing to do with what was agreed. The statement that matters most, the one that sent oil futures into an immediate spike, put every diplomat on earth into emergency conference calls that blurred the lines between time zones and forced the IRGC leadership to perform its version of strategic recalculation inside whatever bunker it is currently occupying, is this one. Trump wrote, "At my direction, United States forces had a military operation scheduled for tomorrow. Following a request from the Emir of Qatar, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and the President of the United Arab Emirates, I have decided to hold off the planned attack. Serious negotiations are now taking place, and in their opinion, a deal will be made that is very acceptable to the United States and all countries in the Middle East and beyond. This deal will include, importantly, no nuclear weapons for Iran." Based on my respect for these leaders, I have instructed the Secretary of War, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and the United States military that we will not be doing the scheduled attack of Iran tomorrow, but have further instructed them to be prepared to go forward with a full, large-scale assault of Iran on a moment's notice in the event that an acceptable deal is not reached. Read every sentence of that statement with the analytical weight it carries. Because this is not a diplomatic announcement. This is the most sophisticated piece of strategic communication in the entire conflict, and it changes everything about the next 48 to 72 hours in ways that the surface reading of the statement does not fully capture. But let's back all the way up, because to understand why Trump's announcement that a planned attack has been postponed at the request of 3 Gulf Arab leaders is not a softening of the American position, but a hardening of it through a completely different mechanism. Why the explosions currently occurring in southern Tehran at sensitive sites have now become so frequent that Iranian state media has stopped trying to explain them entirely. Why an IRGC naval vessel has now fully sunk in the Persian Gulf near Kharg Island. Why 20 Iranian oil tankers are sitting motionless outside Kharg Island because the onshore storage tanks are literally full and crude oil is now visibly spilling into the Gulf from satellite imagery, and why the IRGC's institutional response to all of this has been to create a verified X account for something called the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, train pro-regime civilian women on AK-47s during primetime national television programming, and hold mass weddings for reportedly 1,000 IRGC couples simultaneously. You need to understand the specific strategic architecture of Trump's statement, and why naming the 3 Gulf Arab leaders rather than Pakistan is the most consequential diplomatic repositioning of the ceasefire period's entire back-channel structure. Let's start with the explosions. In the southern parts of Tehran, there have been explosions at sensitive sites, multiple explosions over multiple nights. Iranian state media, which previously responded to similar explosions with the gas leak explanation, then the unexploded American bomb explanation when the gas leak narrative collapsed under the weight of its own absurdity, given the frequency and geographic distribution of the events, has now stopped providing any explanation whatsoever. The cessation of explanation is the most revealing signal. When an authoritarian regime's state media stops explaining events that are visible to its own population and that population's extended family networks communicating through circumvention tools like VPNs, it is because the explanation options have been exhausted. The gas leak narrative required the Iranian public to believe that their country's gas infrastructure was failing simultaneously across multiple cities in a pattern that consistently targeted sensitive military and security sites rather than residential neighborhoods or commercial districts. That narrative collapsed. The unexploded American bomb narrative required the Iranian public to believe that American precision weapons, whose precision was actually the stated basis for the ceasefire's legitimacy as a military pause rather than an American defeat, were somehow imprecise enough to leave large quantities of unexploded ordnance distributed haphazardly across the country. That narrative collapsed under the weight of its own internal contradiction. When you stop explaining something, it is because every explanation you can provide makes the situation worse than the explanation's absence. The explosions are happening. They are happening at sensitive sites. State media is silent. Draw your own conclusions. Now let's get into the IRGC ship sinking near Kharg Island, because this event in the western part of the Hormuz area tells you something specific about the ongoing enforcement activity that the ceasefire label has not paused, and that the IRGC's propaganda apparatus has been unable to narrative as anything other than what it objectively is. An Iranian naval vessel that had previously been struck in an American engagement has now fully sunk in the Persian Gulf. The vessel was already damaged from a prior strike. It had been attempting to either continue operating or simply survive in place, depending on which interpretation of its observed movements you credit. Despite that damage, it could not remain afloat. It is now at the bottom of the Persian Gulf, adding its own contribution to the oil contamination that is spreading across the Gulf from multiple sources that the blockade's enforcement actions and the storage crisis at Kharg Island are producing simultaneously. 20 Iranian oil tankers are currently sitting motionless in the waters off Kharg Island, with maximum oil contamination visible in commercial satellite imagery around them. 20 tankers, motionless. Because the storage tanks at Kharg Island have reached maximum capacity, not nearly full, not approaching capacity, full. The oil that Iran is extracting from its fields has nowhere to go. The tankers are full. The storage tanks are full. The production that continues, because stopping it risks permanent reservoir damage, is producing oil that is literally spilling into the Persian Gulf because no storage remains, and no tanker can be loaded because no tanker can depart, because the blockade has closed every maritime export route. This is the physics clock's terminal phase visible from orbit. The oil spill is not a military action in the conventional sense. It is the physical overflow of an economic system that has been sealed at its export end and is now exceeding its storage capacity at every single point along the chain from wellhead to terminal. The economic pressure is no longer theoretical. It is pouring into the water. Now let's talk about Trump's planned attack tomorrow statement in the full analytical depth it requires, because this statement is simultaneously the most direct military threat Trump has made in this entire conflict and the most sophisticated diplomatic maneuver he has executed since the Beijing summit. The statement announces that the United States had a military operation scheduled for tomorrow. Let's be precise about what that means and what it does not mean. There is no scenario in which the United States military did not have detailed operational plans for every contingency in the Iran theatre ready for execution on a moment's notice. The planning, the pre-positioning, the weapons restocking, the Delta Force operators confirmed in the region since March, the AC-130J Ghost Riders confirmed in theatre, the F-16CJ Wild Weasel suppression of enemy air defences surging sortie rates, the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators restocked. All of this represents a military apparatus that has been planning, rehearsing and positioning for resumed major combat operations continuously since the ceasefire began. Saying that an attack was scheduled for tomorrow is not revealing a specific operational secret that would otherwise not exist. It is revealing that the planning, which everyone with access to satellite imagery and flight tracking data already knew was advanced, had reached the specific authorization threshold that Trump describes as scheduled. The specific genius of the statement structure is what he chose to do with that authorization. He did not cancel it. He postponed it. Specifically at the request of 3 Arab Gulf leaders, the Emir of Qatar, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, the President of the UAE. Read who is not in that list. Pakistan, the country that was the primary mediating party throughout the ceasefire period, the country that housed the Islamabad talks, the country whose Field Marshal and Prime Minister Trump specifically described as the motivation for agreeing to the ceasefire in the first place. Pakistan is absent from the postponement statement. the Gulf Arabs are present. That substitution is the most consequential diplomatic repositioning of the ceasefire period. It removes the mediating role from the party whose neutrality has been systematically compromised, specifically by an Iranian Air Force intelligence aircraft that has been parked 10 kilometers from Islamabad throughout the ceasefire period, and places it in the hands of the parties who are directly affected by the conflict's continuation and who have the most specific and credible leverage with both the Iranian civilian diplomatic faction and the IRGC command structure. Trump told the Emir of Qatar, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and the President of the UAE that the United States was going to attack Iran tomorrow. He then agreed to hold off, specifically because they asked him to. The Gulf Arab leaders now own the postponement. If the IRGC does not produce an acceptable deal within the window that the postponement creates, the next American large-scale assault is understood by every party in the region as having been specifically enabled by the Gulf Arab leaders' personal request for a delay that the IRGC then used to avoid rather than facilitate a deal. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia does not want to be the person who asked Trump to wait and then watch the IRGC squander the window. The Emir of Qatar does not want his personal credibility with the American president expended on a delay that produced nothing. And the President of the UAE, whose country is still intercepting Iranian drones during the ceasefire, and whose Baraka nuclear plant's outer perimeter generator is still not repaired from Sunday's strike, has the most immediate and personal stake in the IRGC producing an acceptable deal rather than being bombed tomorrow instead of tonight. Trump has converted the Gulf Arab leaders from observers of the diplomatic process into active participants who have personally staked their credibility with Washington on the outcome of the window his statement created. That is not a softening of American pressure. That is the multiplication of pressure sources applied to the IRGC from a direction that the IRGC's internal calculus has not fully prepared for. He wrote that if the Islamic Republic admits their navy is gone and resting at the bottom of the sea and their air force is no longer with them, and if their entire military walks out of Tehran with weapons dropped and hands held high, each shouting, "I surrender," while wildly waving the white flag, and if their entire remaining leadership signs all necessary documents of surrender, the failing New York Times and corrupt CNN will headline that Iran had a masterful and brilliant victory over the United States. Trump is preemptively dismantling the face-saving narrative architecture that the IRGC needs to exist in order to authorize the civilian diplomatic faction to make nuclear concessions that the IRGC can then describe to its domestic audience as something other than surrender. The question of whether this is deliberate pressure or genuine contempt for the Iranian regime's narrative management is less important than its operational effect. It tells the IRGC that the face-saving path out does not exist in the American media environment. The only remaining question is whether the IRGC will accept the outcome that the military reality requires, regardless of how it is narrativized. Now let's get into Iran's institutional collapse, because the chain of command breakdown that the analytical community has been documenting for weeks is now producing visible behavioral symptoms that are more revealing than any official statement from any Iranian government official. The top of the Iranian power structure is in a state that can be described charitably as unclear, and uncharitably as absent. The new supreme leader, reportedly Mujtaba Khamenei, has not been seen publicly in a format that allows independent verification of his condition or his active governance. The previous supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, died and has reportedly not yet been formally buried, which, in the context of the information management that the regime is conducting around the leadership transition, tells you that the regime's priorities during this period have not included the ceremonial and religious functions that would normally accompany a leadership succession at this level. The IRGC command structure is blocking the civilian government from making decisions. The civilian president, Pezeshkian, cannot appoint his own ministers. The foreign minister, Araghchi, cannot make diplomatic concessions without IRGC authorization that the IRGC's institutional survival logic prevents it from granting. And the IRGC generals who are actually running the country are operating in an information environment so isolated from external reality that their subordinates are reporting battlefield victories that do not exist. Because reporting accurate battlefield information risks punishment for delivering bad news. The chain of command is broken in the specific direction that produces maximum institutional dysfunction. The leadership at the top is isolated from reality by the information management of the layer below it. The layer below is isolated from the consequences of its decisions by the layer below that. And the layer at the bottom, the actual IRGC soldiers who are being trained on television alongside pro-regime civilian women and who are being married off in mass weddings to boost morale, is operating without any accurate picture of the strategic situation they are inside. This is not a command structure that can make the rational decision that the accumulated evidence of the conflict's trajectory requires. It is a command structure that is performing decisions for each layer of its hierarchy without any layer having an accurate picture of what the other layers are doing or what the actual operational situation is. Now let's talk about the AK-47 training on national television and the mass weddings, because these two developments reveal the IRGC's institutional psychology at its most exposed and most analytically revealing level. They deserve serious analysis rather than the dismissal they might receive as mere propaganda curiosities. Iranian state television is now regularly broadcasting programs in which pro-regime civilian women are being taught to operate AK-47 assault rifles. The safety, the charging handle, the magazine insertion, the basic mechanics of a weapon that the Islamic Republic has historically prohibited its general civilian population from possessing, specifically because the government fears that an armed civilian population might use those weapons against the government that rules them. The same government that killed thousands of protesters during the January 2026 uprising is now publicly instructing the segment of the civilian population that it has identified as regime loyal in weapons operation. The specific contradiction embedded in that sequence tells you something about the IRGC's threat assessment. The government that fears its own population armed has now decided that the threat it faces from an external military operation is sufficient to override that fear. It is arming its loyalists, but not to fight the Americans. American forces that reach Tehran in the scenario the IRGC is apparently planning for are not going to be stopped by pro-regime civilian women with AK-47s. The weapons training is a domestic morale and loyalty management operation. It gives the regime-loyal segment of the population a sense of participation in the conflict's defense that creates psychological investment in the regime's survival rather than productive combat capability against any external military threat. And then there is the state TV presenter who was previously given a real firearm and promptly shot a hole through the studio ceiling during a live broadcast, was subsequently given a different AK-47 that he used to shoot a UAE flag painted on a studio backdrop, and has now been given what appears to be an air gun with which he is shooting at pictures of President Trump on the studio wall. The progressively less lethal weapons with which this presenter has been equipped across successive broadcasts is the most complete unintentional metaphor for the IRGC's operational trajectory that this entire conflict has produced. The mass weddings deserve a separate analytical treatment because the specific morale mechanism they represent tells you about the IRGC's understanding of what is motivating its soldiers and what has stopped motivating them. The IRGC held mass weddings for reportedly 1,000 couples simultaneously, broadcasting the ceremonies on state television, with imagery that included a photograph of what social media described as a cardboard cutout of the new supreme leader, positioned between the wedding couples in the ceremony space. 110 couples were married at Imam Hussein Square in Tehran, before a procession toward Valier Assa Square for continued celebration. The institutional logic of mass weddings as a military morale tool is the acknowledgement that the personnel the organization needs to retain and motivate have been asking for something that the organization provides in wartime conditions that peacetime posting does not accommodate. Marriage, family formation, the domestic stability that gives a soldier something to fight for in the specific sense of returning to rather than the abstract sense of defending. The IRGC is providing this incentive in a mass production format that reflects the scale of the morale problem it is trying to address and the urgency with which it is trying to address it. You hold mass weddings for 1,000 couples simultaneously when the morale deficit requiring that intervention exists across thousands of personnel simultaneously. And the timing. In the middle of a conflict where the organization has lost more than 160 naval vessels, its air force, its underground missile cities, and roughly 90% of its defense industrial base, tells you that the IRGC is attempting to retain personnel through incentive provision rather than through the ideological commitment that its institutional narrative was supposed to provide. When your soldiers are motivated by the promise of marriage and family formation rather than by the promise of martyrdom for a revolutionary cause, the revolutionary cause's motivational power has been exhausted. Now let's talk about the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, the PGSA, which created an official X account to announce its intention to manage commercial transit through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson confirmed that the PGSA is real, that it is the new institutional framework through which Iran intends to manage commercial transit through the strait, and that collecting toll fees for transit is legal and logically justified according to international maritime law. The X account was created with a verified checkmark, meaning the IRGC or the Iranian government paid Elon Musk directly for the verification status that the account displays. Read what that detail means. Iran is funding Elon Musk, who is one of the American businessmen who was in the room in Beijing during the Trump-Xi summit, who has extensive connections to the American national security and technology ecosystem, and whose company owns the communications platform through which Iran is announcing its intention to toll charge international shipping in a waterway that Xi Jinping told Trump he opposes Iran using for toll charging, that Rubio said the United States will never support, that the Beijing summit's joint statement jointly condemned, and that the blockade's 15,000 personnel and 100 aircraft are actively enforcing against the strait's traffic. Iran paid Elon Musk for a blue checkmark to announce a toll-charging mechanism for a waterway the United States is blockading and that China has publicly opposed Iran using as a toll-charging instrument. The strategic absurdity of that sequence would be difficult to construct intentionally. It is the product of an institution whose decision-making is so disconnected from the strategic reality it occupies that it is spending money on social media verification while its storage tanks overflow, its naval vessels sink near Kharg Island, its cities experience unexplained explosions at sensitive sites, and an American large-scale assault has been postponed by 1 day at the request of Gulf Arab leaders who will ask for exactly 0 additional days of postponement if the PGSA's first governance action on its verified X account is to announce toll collection in a strait where the American military has been enforcing a blockade for 5 weeks. Now let's get into what the CENTCOM F-35 refueling post communicates and why the most apparently unremarkable social media content from the American military's official accounts is actually the most strategically significant. CENTCOM posted an image of an F-35 stealth fighter being refueled during what it described as a routine patrol over regional waters in the Middle East. The post contained no operational details beyond the image and the routine patrol description. Read why that post exists. If the patrol is truly routine, there is no informational value in the post for any operational audience. Routine patrols happen thousands of times per month across every combatant command. They are not posted on official social media accounts because they are routine. They are posted when the routine itself is the message. CENTCOM is telling every relevant audience, the IRGC command structure monitoring American military communications, the Gulf Arab leaders who are now personally invested in the deal window Trump's postponement created, the Iranian civilian population that has access to VPN-enabled social media despite the internet shutdown, and every international commercial shipping operator calculating whether the strait is safe for transit, that American air power is overhead continuously, that it is being refueled for sustained operations, that it operates routinely in the airspace over the regional waters that the PGSA's X account is claiming to manage, that there is nothing routine about its presence that is anything other than the most visible possible demonstration of who actually controls the airspace above the strait. The F-35 refueling post is not a social media update. It is a strategic communication asset deployed with the precision of any other weapon in the American military's arsenal. The routine is the message. And the message is that nothing Iran's PGSA announces on its verified X account changes the physical reality that American F-35s are overhead being refueled for continuous operations in the airspace the PGSA claims to manage. Now let's bring all three tracks together into the complete strategic picture of what May 19th, 2026 represents, and what the next window that Trump's postponement has created will determine. The military track is at its most operationally advanced state since the ceasefire began. An attack was described as scheduled for tomorrow. It has been postponed by 1 day at the explicit request of 3 Gulf Arab leaders, who have now staked their credibility with Washington on the outcome of the postponement window. The AC-130J Ghost Riders are in theatre. The F-35s are being refueled for continuous operations, and CENTCOM is posting about it publicly. The Delta Force operators have been in the region since March. The GBU-57s are restocked. Operation Sledgehammer is named. The explosions at sensitive sites in Tehran are continuing. An IRGC vessel has sunk near Kharg Island. The full large-scale assault is on a moment's notice. The economic track has reached its terminal phase in every observable metric. 20 tankers are motionless outside Kharg Island because the storage tanks have reached maximum capacity and oil is spilling into the Persian Gulf. The $500 million daily blockade loss continues compounding. The IRGC ship that sank is adding its oil to the Gulf contamination. The PGSA X account is collecting verification fees from Elon Musk, while the storage crisis it was purportedly created to address through toll revenue continues producing oil spills visible from orbit. The diplomatic track has been transferred from the Pakistani mediation framework to the Gulf Arab leader direct engagement framework through Trump's postponement statement, which named Qatar, Saudi Arabia and the UAE rather than Pakistan as the parties whose request created the postponement window. The Gulf Arab leaders now own the outcome. They have every incentive to use every available channel of pressure on the IRGC to produce the deal that would justify their request. And the IRGC has every institutional reason to refuse that deal while having every operational reason to accept it before the moment's notice becomes the operational order. Here is the honest assessment of where this conflict stands on May 19th, 2026, and what the analysis of every available operational, economic, and diplomatic indicator suggests about where the moment's notice arrives. The IRGC leadership is isolated from the strategic reality of the conflict it is managing in the specific way that authoritarian institutions become isolated when delivering bad news to superiors carries institutional consequences more serious than the bad news itself. The generals are being told they are winning. The state media is broadcasting victories. 1,000 couples are getting married simultaneously to boost morale. Women are being trained on AK-47s on national television. A cardboard cutout of the new Supreme Leader is standing in for the actual Supreme Leader at mass wedding ceremonies. A state TV presenter is shooting airgun pellets at pictures of Trump on a studio wall after being stripped of progressively more lethal weapons following incidents involving studio ceiling holes and UAE flag backdrops. The PGSA is paying Elon Musk for a blue checkmark. And Trump has just announced that a full, large-scale assault of Iran is on a moment's notice, pending the outcome of a deal window that 3 Gulf Arab leaders have personally staked their credibility on producing. The IRGC thinks it is winning because no one inside its command structure is permitted to tell it that it is not. The observable world tells a very different story. 20 tankers overflowing outside Kharg Island. An IRGC ship at the bottom of the Persian Gulf. Explosions at sensitive sites in Tehran that state media has stopped explaining. More than 160 naval vessels already at the bottom of the Gulf. Roughly 90% of the defense industrial base destroyed. 2 to 3 fast attack boats per straight transit where 40 used to operate. A nuclear power plant struck by a drone during a ceasefire. An air gun being used against Trump's picture after a real rifle destroyed the studio ceiling. This is not the operational profile of an organization that is winning. This is the operational profile of an organization that has been told it is winning by every layer of its command structure, because every layer of its command structure is afraid of what happens when it tells the layer above what is actually happening. And Trump has just told the Gulf Arab leaders that they have one window to produce the deal before the moment's notice becomes operational. The PGSA X account will have very few posting days remaining after that window closes.